Last week, we discussed the challenges individuals face in making decisions. And among the challenges, and important for our purposes in organizational settings where we're dealing with complex problems, is the challenge of bounded rationality. And what bounded rationality is a description of how individuals make decisions and what challenges they have in making those decisions. And in particular, the challenges are the limited cognitive capacity each of us has as an individual. And in the face of complicated problems, we have a hard time considering all of the things that might be relevant in making a decision. And then also the challenges we face in information gathering, that we can't get the information not available to us. And as we saw when we did the Speed Ventures simulation, you got to make a decision whether your information is complete or not, and the best possible decision that you can make. So in organizations, there are ways that we circumvent and account for the limitations of individuals. And these include both organizing the information available, getting people to give us their ideas, their analysis, the information that is gathered in our reporting system to help us make better decisions. And then also we use group decision making to put multiple brains on complex problems and get a diverse set of inputs and experiences and ideas, and that we hope helps us make better decisions. As we talked about in class, and we demonstrated with the bird communication example, organizational information systems can be vulnerable to communication problems. And in particular, if we think about in an organizational setting where we have a division of labor, so we have people in different departments with different perspectives, we have hierarchy, different different levels of influence in the organization, and we have this kind of notion, basic notion of bureaucratic structures in which people have spans of control. There is communication channels that exist, and in particular, we hold very much true, and it's kind of embedded in how we think about organizations. This notion of the chain of command, these communication channels through chains, and that we have to report to every level in the organization. These kind of communication structures are very vulnerable to communication problems. And in particular, what we looked at is taking from actually information systems theory and how they try to characterize the movement of information through an information system. Organizations as information systems have a lot of vulnerabilities. And one of the real difficulties that managers face in complex information systems is the load that they're confronted with. It's a lot of information. Our information systems are really good at generating lots of information. The information we hope is accurate, but as we said, the more detail in the information, it'll help us be accurate, and it compounds the load problem. Lots of detailed information usually ends up being lots of noise, and associated with load is the increased amount of useless information. And then as our information transmission has gotten speedier, we've had electronic communication, that's added to the load problem. And then people are usually trying to get information through multiple channels. That adds to the load problem as well. And what we talked about is this tendency for managers to want to manage load, to try and decrease load. And in the decreasing of load, the organization becomes vulnerable to all sorts of information distortions, incompleteness, complete information. And in particular, what we talked about is in communication through chains, one of the interesting things that happens is information actually gets lost as it moves through a chain. And the chains can be quite short. 3 or 4 people can very much distort the information. So it gets lost as it moves through the chain, but interpretation gets added. So it's not only that information's lost, that information is added, and it's added in the form of interpretation. So a lot of what we talked about was, I hope, kind of selling you on this notion that what leaders do, as opposed to managers who just are kind of victims of the information structure that they have available to them, uh, that we saw, and this was in the Mintzberg article that we used to kick off the course, and what do managers do. Effective managers, effective leaders actually are information seekers. They are not passive with respect to information, and they are, in an interesting way, load seekers. They actually may end up managing their load by ignoring an awful lot of what is provided through the organizational reporting system, and they actually have a tendency to bypass. So they cultivate direct channels. They spend time observing their organizations. We characterize this as being actually effective listeners of the various non-informational messages that are available from the organization, the kind of things that you can perceive by actively engaging and walking around the firm, having a presence. We said this very much presumes that you're not scapegoating in vertical relationships, and that you're not punishing people who disclose problems, and so that's extremely important, to keep the channels open and build trust. And then effective leaders very actively participate in the informal system of social relationships. Informal leaders are as embedded in the trust network as anybody in the organization, and maybe even more so, and very actively use that trust network that you covered in the readings to really make sure that they get timely and accurate information. And so, while we absolutely understand that information is really powerful in helping people make better decisions, one of the things that we kind of quickly come to the conclusion of, that effective leaders are actually doing an awful lot on the informal side. I personally love dashboards and key performance indicators. I deploy them. I want people to have them and be thinking in those ways. But I don't want my information on the organization and what's going on in the organization to be dashboard information only. Right? That's useful for reporting. That's useful for documenting your effectiveness. That is not actually really great leadership to manage remotely through a dashboard kind of mechanism. Really effective leaders get out. They know their organization. They know what's going on. They're ahead of problems. They're not learning about them after the fact. And that's what we described as we talked about how effective leaders access organizational information. We also talked about group decision making, and the fact that it can be extremely powerful if we get people. Again, naturally, we have this division of labor, which is a difference of perspective. We can potentially really leverage off of difference in hierarchy and different statuses. People have different perspectives associated with their status. And then also, this group decision making occurs in an organization which is time poor, and especially the information exchange that can happen in a group process can be highly efficient. And so groups are not necessarily per se inefficient, although we generally talk about our meeting schedules in organizations as being a waste of time. Although I think that's more of a commentary on how badly the meetings are run and how badly the group processes are conducted, rather than a condemnation of meetings and group decision making. Meetings can be a really effective way of creating information availability. And there's some time consuming parts to this. We also need to understand in these settings these conformity pressures and the problems that are associated with groupthink. As we talked about groupthink, really the big process issues are the directive leadership, the social information effects, where information is introduced in a particular order, especially where there are these kind of strong group norms for conformity. And one of the big problems we said with groupthink is it causes people to be very confident about a decision, even though they actually haven't really considered it as well as a group process is capable of doing. So as we talk about group decision making, one of the things that came up over and over again is it's really very important that leaders kind of understand these process issues. They understand censoring and the things that come up to make sure the groups are effectively run. Another really key piece in what we talked about is the understanding of how there is actually a diffusion of responsibility in groups. We think of groups as participation mechanisms, and so of course that should increase commitment. But in fact, groups have a diffusion of volition. And so we really have to, in our process leadership with groups, make sure that the volitional elements and the responsibility elements are associated with any decisions we happen to make in groups. And the final commentary we had on our groups and organizations is that groups have many purposes. They're used in a lot of different ways, right? So they're used for decision making. That's probably one of the lesser uses. An awful lot of how they're used is for information sharing. And then we also talked about this kind of concept of legitimation of decisions, where the group process is actually leveraging the conformity pressures to get people on board to implement a decision and make sure that we not only have made the decision, but we're going to implement the decision, that there's going to be follow through on it. So the ways that groups are used in the organization, we covered this in lecture in the note, there are lots of uses. And one of the key things that leaders do is actually understand the purpose of the meeting and run their process accordingly. Right, you use a different process if it's just a communication meeting. You worry about different kind of information sharing happening. In a decision-making meeting, you probably still want that information sharing, but at some point you also want decisions made, and you want those decisions ultimately to be implemented. One of the things that we talked about in this section is in complex organization, there is a separation between decision making and decision implementation. And it's quite possible to make a decision and have it never implemented. And so effective leaders are about the doing, they're about the implementation, and they manage decision processes, communication processes to actually get something done. On the further reading, I can highly recommend the Nate Silver Signal and the Noise. Nate Silver became very well known for his capacity to very accurately call presidential elections and political campaigns. And the book is about, how do you go about in fairly complex data structure separating out the signal and the noise. And he talks about everything from weather prediction to politics. But it's a really great book on thinking about, information challenges and thinking about this, how do we tease out a signal in what is a pretty noisy system. And as a leader in an organization, part of when you're dealing with load, you're dealing with noise. You're dealing with a lot of useless information, and you're trying to find that piece of signal, that indicator that helps you make a really great decision. And then the book that Bernie Madoff is just a great, um, you know, coverage of what's a fascinating episode in U.S. business history, especially financial history. And as we talked about in class, the critical role that complex organizations played in this and their inability to recognize the information that was right in front of them. We had a reading from Sunstein and Hasty on groups, and they have a book out. It's actually nicely affordable. I think it's about $25 from the Harvard Business Review Press, and the whole focus of the book is how to get beyond groupthink and make your group smarter. And then finally, the movie Apollo 13 has got one of the great episodes of a group brainstorming, coming up with a solution, and saving the day. And it's really an opportunity to see, you get an appreciation from this of seeing the creativity that's possible in a group and what they're able to do, both through the communication with NASA mission control and what the astronauts are able to put together in a really potentially catastrophic situation, leveraged in a big way the power of groups. And so it's just a great illustration of some of the stuff we've talked about when we're really getting what we want out of groups. Unfortunately, and many times in organizations, we're not. We're getting exactly what we don't want, which is we're getting failure to share information. We're not getting people weighing in who have important perspective, and we're simultaneously, and this is the real threat of groupthink, we're simultaneously increasing people's confidence in the decision at a point where they might want to take a more incremental approach.